Hi everyone, just before we get into the episode, we wanted to do a quick trigger warning to share what we're going to be talking about today covers topics around pregnancy loss, miscarriage and abortion. We also wanted to share, as always, that the views represent us and not our employer or clients that we work with.
Hello and welcome back to the Experience Lounge podcast, episode 30. We are back. We are delighted to be back. It is great to have you all back, so thank you for joining us. Before we get into the topic of discussion today, which is a heavy one and certainly one that we are really keen to discuss, Laura, how are you doing? What have you been up to?
I am good. I think when we last recorded, I was maybe just about to leave my in-laws. We've left now, and now in our house, settling in. I think it takes a bit of time to get settled, but yeah, enjoying. We've decorated out this room, so you can see the nice pretty wallpaper.
Gorgeous.
Will now be my background.
Yeah,
channeling my Bali vibes from my time in Asia when the weather's horrible here. I can just think that I'm on a beach somewhere. So yeah, the house has been good. Did my first Europe holiday in, I don't know, probably about 3 years with COVID and everything. I think France was where we went last. So we went to Lanzarote on an all-inclusive, which again, I haven't done for yonks. And it was good. Yeah, not super relaxing because I have a 3-year-old. So I sort of feel like I traded in my day job at work for a different kind of work during the 10 days. But there was sun and cocktails and I did manage to read some books. So it was good. It's good. How about you?
Oh, very nice. Well, I'm jealous of your European holidays, although I have just been back as well. So I returned home for a couple of weeks. My sister-in-law got married. She got married in Dublin, which was lovely. So we went back for that and to catch up with family and everything. It wasn't really a holiday for me because, for those of you that don't know, I'm a bit of a hobby florist, so I really enjoy doing florals. And I offered in a moment of madness to do my sister-in-law's wedding flowers, which was just way more than I could do, but massively overcommitted, which is just, my own fault. But it all turned out okay, which was great. But lots and lots of late nights in my in-laws' garage, freezing cold, because as much as it's summer in Ireland, it's still freezing, especially because I live in Singapore, right? It's always hot all the time. So that was my fun trip back home, and just back. I caught COVID as well again, so
lucky. Well, unlucky, obviously.
And I got my booster a couple of weeks ago as well. So I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to go back and be totally safe. So the lesson here is never, ever pick me for team sports. If you are thinking about the end of the world and who you need on your side, don't pick me because I'll die first. That's just how it's going to go. Like, my immune system is not built for this. So that was eventful, but I'm back and I'm settled now. And it's good to be back. We took some time out for sure. And some of it more impromptu that we'll talk about in a second. But it was nice to have a bit of a break, but really good to be back as well.
Yes, I think we, because it's not our main job, is it?
No.
So I think sometimes life happens and work happens and so sometimes we take breaks that are planned and sometimes we're like, oh, it's been a few weeks, but we're back, as we said. So I'm excited to get into our regular rhythm of weekly episodes.
Absolutely. It's good to be back. So, and thanks everyone for being patient. But also, we have 29 other episodes. If you're really eager, you could have just gone back through those. They're really good, I promise. And we were still posting on Instagram intermittently. So if you were looking for your human resources, employee experience meme fix, we were still here. So, head over there if you're not following us on Instagram already. So before we get into the topic of discussion today, which is supporting women's health at work, Roe v. Wade, obviously incredibly topical. We wanted to get this out quickly. We have a couple of life updates because, as I mentioned, we took some time out, which was half planned and also half impromptu. And we both feel this is incredibly relevant to the topic at hand. So, Laura, do you want to talk us through what you've been doing and where you've been?
Yes. So for those that have listened for a while, you may recall our pregnancy sort of loss at work episode. I think we did it in October for pregnancy loss awareness week, and at the time I'd said I'd never experienced a loss. So again, those that listen for a while, I've got a 3-year-old little boy, and actually first pregnancy was, other than getting gestational diabetes, was very straightforward, sort of no challenges. So I guess I'd always been that so far like one of the, and it is now, I think, one of the lucky people that had just had had a pregnancy test that then resulted in a baby. But I actually found myself pregnant in early May, was it, or mid early May? Yeah, just trying to work through the dates of when it was, with my second pregnancy, and I guess based on my previous experience, had sort of thought it'll be fine. But I don't know, there was something at the back of my mind now, because I think since being a parent, I'm just so much more aware of loss than I think I ever was. So I think of pregnancy loss, but also actually people that have lost their children, at various different ages as they become a parent. And I think also, our conversations, we're obviously friends outside of the podcast too, and what you'd been through as well, Sasha, it was just more at the front of my mind. And what had ended up happening is I had a bit of pain in my left side, which didn't feel like anything I'd sort of experienced before. So it wasn't kind of period type cramping, for those that know what that feels like. And so I'd gone to the doctors, because in early pregnancy, obviously one of the challenges or worries if you get pain in your abdominal is that it could be ectopic pregnancy. So then I went in the UK, there's an early pregnancy assessment unit, and that's basically the sort of service that supports women through early stages of pregnancy. And it's also where you would go if you'd had kind of recurrent miscarriages, if you've had ectopic pregnancies, all of that kind of stuff. So I was sort of admitted into that service, and went then through having a number of, which I think for those, again, that may have experienced this, and I know, Sasha, you sort of been through some of it too, having a lot of blood tests to check your hormone levels, so your HCG, very anxiety inducing in terms of having to go to the hospital for them to test where those were. Then they kind of call you a few hours later and say they're at this certain level, and obviously in a viable pregnancy you want that to be trending up, because it means that your body is doing all the things it needs to do to keep that sort of that baby safe. But mine had started to trend down. So they were worried for two reasons. One, because the trending down, or when it sort of is a bit kind of intermittent or goes up and down, it again can be a sign of an ectopic pregnancy. So I was kind of going to the hospital every couple of days for these tests, and then also for scans as well. And in the end, they sort of said to me, "It's trending down. You're going to have a miscarriage, basically." And so I did. Luckily, it wasn't an ectopic pregnancy, and I was, again, sort of having researched a lot. And I think this topic is so pertinent in terms of what's happening in the US. I didn't have to have any medical management, is what they call it here in the UK, which is where you would take any drugs to sort of pass the. I don't always know what the right language to use, to be honest, but sort of to pass.
It's personal, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah,
whatever.
To pass what's there. I don't know how to describe that in a different way. So I was lucky, I suppose, in that sense that it wasn't that. But I think what came with it is I'm very much, and I know it's all personal choice in terms of how you view things. At the time, and I still think I would now, in the early stages, I do see it as a group of cells. But I think the thing for me is it was the hope that's gone. So when you have that positive pregnancy test, for my previous experience, that did mean a baby. That's my son Henry. He's 3. He's a character, and he's the absolute love of my life. But it wasn't meant to be this time. And I think I've probably at the moment compartmentalized it somewhere, which I don't know. We I'm sure we'll revisit some of that discussion at some point. But I think it's the hope for me that is that's gone, in the sense of if we try again, we have another one. I'll always know now that it's not necessarily going to mean a baby. And I know you went through 3 or 4 of those in the last kind of 18 months as well. So yeah, I think life updates, it was a lot. And I think it was hard because I had to take a little bit of time off work and, trying to go through those emotions. So we wanted to share that because we've always said on the podcast, we want to talk about things that are really real and affect people in the workplace and from an experience perspective. But also, actually, I think it's super relevant for this topic. So that's my my little update. But you have another one, which is amazing and exciting. So, yeah.
Well, first of all, before I get into that, incredibly sorry for your loss. And
thank you.
we obviously talk outside of the podcast, people. If you didn't know, we're good friends. So I think it's incredibly brave of you to open up about it. And I think this is a process. And I think you describing what you went through is just, as you say, very relevant to this topic, which will ultimately culminate in us discussing the importance of reproductive health at work, regardless of your situation, and how the two cannot be separate. And, what you go through at home when you're going through a miscarriage, you carry that into work, not even just during that time, but during that recovery. When you get pregnant again, when you're going through pregnancy after loss, like, it shapes who you are as an individual, and you can't separate the two. And that's why this is a work topic. So yeah, incredibly brave, and always here for you, and always here for anyone on the podcast as well that may be going through something similar. Please reach out to us. Like, we're more than happy to support you.
And actually, that's one thing I'd say, and it's, I think it's what we're trying to do here with this podcast, which is the more I've talked about it, especially at work, with not like worn a t-shirt that said, but I've confided in colleagues that I trust, and the more that I've told people, the more the other women have said to me, "Oh, that's happened to me," or they've shared their stories. And I think that's the whole point. You need more people to talk about it, because that then makes it okay for us to talk about some of these topics in the workplace. So yeah, we're absolutely here for anybody that has gone through something similar and wants to talk about it, because I think that's super important.
Totally agree. And so I guess similar, and we've spoken about this on the podcast, I have a history of pregnancy loss and have struggled with getting pregnant for a long time. So we also took some time out, obviously, to support Laura's recovery. But I am expecting. So I'm expecting a little boy in October. So I'm just over 24 weeks pregnant. And I say this, of course, with delight, but it's mixed emotions, which, again, maybe this is something we can come back to as a topic, Laura, pregnancy after loss at work as well. It's an incredibly anxiety-inducing time. Like, Laura, it hasn't been the easiest pregnancy. We've had to do a lot of tests. There were times in this pregnancy, as we'll come on to talk about, where we had to consider termination for medical reasons, all incredibly emotive subjects. And of course, that comes with the anxiety of a history of loss as well. So I'm delighted, of course, and very I want to say I'm pleased to announce it. I'm disappointed that I'm announcing it on this podcast episode where we're going to be talking about Roe versus Wade and this ridiculous situation in the US. But nonetheless, that is the update. That's where I've been. I'm not sick. I'm feeling a lot better now. I'm just getting a bit fuller, I think, is the best way. My mum described me. She said, "You're looking very healthy." So if I look a little bit fuller on the video podcast, that's why, guys.
Yeah. No, you look great, and I'm so pleased for you after everything. But equally, again, that bravery to say it comes with a lot of anxiety, because I think it does, right? You would expect it to, I think, after what you've been through. So
absolutely. So again, here for anyone at work going through pregnancy after loss, or if you've been through pregnancy after loss, or you're facing a loss, like, again, this is, as you said, Laura, like, we want this to be an open, honest podcast. These are very real issues that men and women face in the workplace. Like, my husband experiences the same amount of anxiety. Your husband, when you were going through the loss, experienced a loss as well. So, this is very much an entire workplace issue. So yes. Anything else before we jump into the topic?
Oh, I think one thing to say, and we will have done a mention of this at the start, the episode anyway, and talk through the trigger warnings. But all the views we're going to talk about, this is a very emotive topic, right? So all the views that we're going to talk about are very much our own. They don't represent the organisations or the clients that we work for. But I think, as we've said, the purpose of this podcast is we always wanted to amplify voices of different underrepresented groups, but also actually give that diversity of thought. So that's what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Great call out. So let's get into the topic. So as I said, supporting women's health at work, Roe v. Wade. So unless you've been hiding under a rock over the last week, there has been huge news from the US. So let me just do a quick summary, a little bit of context, scene setting here. So, and I will leave all of the links to the news websites and other websites that we have used for the content today. So, the US Supreme Court on Friday, June 24th, took the dramatic step of overturning the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling that recognised a woman's constitutional right to an abortion and legalised it nationwide. In the United States. The court, in a 6-3 ruling powered by its conservative majority, upheld a Republican-backed Mississippi law that bans abortion after 15 weeks. The vote was 5-4 to overturn Roe, with Chief Justice John Roberts writing separately to say that he would have upheld the Mississippi law but not taken the additional step of erasing the precedent altogether. The justices held that Roe v. Wade decision that allowed abortions performed before a fetus would be viable outside the womb between 24 and 28 weeks of pregnancy was wrongly decided because the US Constitution makes no specific mention of abortion rights. For those of you that are like, what was Roe v. Wade? So just a little bit of context here. So in 1969, a 25-year-old single woman, Norma McCorvey, used a pseudonym, Jane Roe, and challenged the criminal abortion laws in Texas. Essentially, what this ended up in is the judge, they judged that a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy was protected by the US Constitution. So this was enshrined almost 50 years ago. So it's been around for a long time. And the case that really triggered the demise of Roe v. Wade and the removal of this from the US Constitution is a case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization related to Mississippi law. So that is what triggered this entire review of Roe v. Wade. And so we are where we are today. As I said, June 24th, this decision was made by the Supreme Court. And what this means right now is the Supreme Court has overturned the constitutional right to abortion. It means that the right to abortion is now ultimately down to the individual states. So the state that you live in, the abortion laws that they have in those states will dictate your right to abortion. And so, without getting into all of the detail, there were a number of states that had these things called trigger laws in place. So as soon as this decision was made by the Supreme Court, there were states that automatically had an anti-abortion law in place that would come into effect straight away. They had prepared for this. And so in states like Kentucky, Louisiana, South Dakota, etc., had an immediate ban on abortion. And there are a number of states that will follow. So Texas, Tennessee, North Dakota, Wyoming, and a few more also have trigger laws in place, but they have a slightly longer process. So this is a huge moment for women's rights, a huge moment for human rights, for women's health. I am personally devastated for the women of America, but not just the women of America, women everywhere. I feel like this is, we both discussed before the episode, this is incredibly emotional for us. And obviously it's incredibly triggering given our situation and what we've been through recently. And so, yeah, this is incredibly disappointing. But Laura, what are your reflections?
I think I've almost, when I've reflected on it, I've gone almost through a little bit of a change curve in terms of actually a lot of anger, to be honest with you, but also actually almost some grief. And then I think where I'm at now is how can we support other women? How can we amplify the voices of women who don't think this is the right thing? But also, like you say, that there's a lot of men that are with us on that fight, right? So I very much, and I think we were sort of talking about this before the episode. I think it's almost the way that I guess I tackle problems and kind of problem solve, and some of that could even be that sort of EX kind of thinking mindset, is that I want to channel it into, well, what can I do? What sort of what can I leverage to do something to support others? So I think this episode, like we said, was really important because employees are going to look to organisations for a position. They're also going to look for how are they going to support. And I think some of the episodes we've talked about before around women's health and how you think about that in an employee experience context is ever so relevant in this discussion. And I've listened to lots of podcasts recently about social activism, and particularly younger generations now in the workforce. They expect the companies that they work for to have a position on some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the challenge is you don't necessarily even need to come out with a position, but you do need to, I think about how are you going to support support your employees through this. So yeah, I've sort of felt a whole range of emotions, to be quite honest. My Friday night, because sort of time zone wise, it was late Friday afternoon here in the UK. I spent so much time on social media and various news outlets just reading for hours on Friday. And then that sort of heavy heart I think I went to bed with, and then I just was quite angry a bit over the weekend, which again, from some of the social media accounts and things that I follow, that was kind of general sentiment. But I don't sort of subscribe to it's a you're right, I'm wrong kind of debate. Like that's not what we're here to talk about. I think it's more what can organisations do? How can we support colleagues, and what does it mean for women and diversity and inclusion of women?
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. I will say, slightly controversially, I also spend a lot of time on social media, and my app of choice at the moment is LinkedIn. And LinkedIn has been a cesspit of inappropriate comments, and I really don't. I feel like we could go down a rabbit hole here, but also want to be very mindful that we are going to talk about the EX side of things. But yeah, just so surprising and disappointing to see some of the comments coming out. But as you say, this is not us getting into a right or wrong debate. But I certainly sit well in the camp of pro-choice, and
me too.
And ultimately the most harrowing thing I think is the realization that this will not stop abortion. Abortion will continue to happen.
Safe abortions, right?
It stops safe abortions, and there are going to be a number of incredibly vulnerable people, marginalized groups who will die as a result of this ruling, and that is most upsetting, I think. Just incredibly harrowing.
I think why we shared at the beginning our own personal reflections, in the sense of what we'd also been through, is for me the almost the most harrowing bit is if you were going through what I went through a few weeks ago, where it was potentially an ectopic pregnancy, or through no fault of a woman's own body, you retain some of, it's a horrible term I think they use medically, they kind of describe
material,
it as material pregnancy product. It's not a nice phrase, but it basically means your body can't naturally pass that. And so often the drugs that they would use, if it's medical management, are the same drugs they would use if you went for an abortion. But that's not about choosing whether it was a pregnancy that wasn't wanted. That might have been a pregnancy that was incredibly wanted, but you were having a miscarriage, and the safest way to make sure that I think it's the mother survived, but also that you could have future pregnancies. And that's the bit I just think for me is incredibly raw at the moment. And then also some of the where women they've experienced violence against them, violating them and their body through incest or rape, and would still be forced to carry a child to term. Like, I mean, some of that I find that really difficult, to be honest with you. And then similar, like, we sort of talked about the termination for medical reasons. I think if you've been pregnant and you've carried a baby to term, I just think the thought of that where a child would die the minute they were born because they weren't able to sustain life, and to make a woman go through that, I just not just the woman, it's the father too. There's obviously the physical aspect for the woman, but I think that's so harrowing to have done that. And that's the bit, I almost don't have any words, but it's
I totally agree with you. And having very recently kind of faced that reality of potentially having to make that decision, I couldn't imagine it as well. And a lot of people talk about percentages of cases we talk about here. So I have been through the medical management of miscarriage, where you take misoprostol, which is the drug that you would be given if you were to have an elective abortion. It's a horrible thing to go through when it's a much wanted pregnancy, but it's a safe way of protecting fertility and also emotionally moving on from a loss of a non-viable pregnancy. It doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't make it an easy choice, but it happens. And then, as you say, looking at TFMR, termination for medical reasons, you make that decision. And so many women I've connected with that have gone through termination for medical reasons, they do it from a place of love for their unborn child and not wishing for a child to suffer. And sometimes I think that is lost in the kind of pro-life debate. But again, it's just going to impact so many women, so many different cases, so many vulnerable groups. And it's just incredibly complex. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about why is it important for organizations to address this. And I think you kind of touched on this already, Laura. People are looking at organizations to have a viewpoint. But why is it important for organizations to not necessarily have an opinion, right, as you say, but why is it important for them to come forward and do something in response?
I think it's, in some ways it's complex, but it's actually about, at its core for me, it's about diversity and inclusion of women. Because actually, if you had equal representation of women in positions of power, making decisions, if whether that's your C-suite or through your senior levels of your organization, you have that representation, that is something that they would go through. And I think why do we need to care about it? Because you have women in your workforce, I think I know that might sound like a bit of an easy answer, but I think it's because women's health isn't separate from work. Like we've said, you can't kind of shut it off. And we've talked on previous podcast episodes, obviously, about how can organisations do more to support women through pregnancy loss, through menopause. I just think it's because it isn't something that you can separate, and it impacts not just women, it impacts men, because you may have a wife, you may have a sister, a daughter, colleagues that you work with, so it impacts everybody. And so I think that's why it's such an important issue.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And this sits under reproductive health for me, right? If we take away, obviously 100%. It's incredibly emotional at the moment, and this one is, arguably more contentious for some people than like the topic of fertility treatments or, infertility, those kind of things. But ultimately it sits under that reproductive health banner. And as an organization, if you have policies and a stance on supporting your employees through that journey, those journeys, then you should be considering this. Absolutely. And as you say, 2, 3, 10, 20 years from now, talent will be looking at how you came out in response. And we'll talk about this in the next point, but it's got to be quick. And it doesn't need to be rushed necessarily, but there does have to be a response, because the longer you wait, that is a reflection of the sense of urgency you have around women's health at work. That's my perspective. But
and we're already seeing, aren't we? Like almost, I think it was Friday evening, like into the weekend, and then more more and more, yesterday being Monday, we're recording on a Tuesday, more and more organisations already coming out. And I think this is the key thing. Some coming out with a really clear stance on their position, but actually some not doing that, because I think, like we said, it's an incredibly emotive topic. You get a lot of challenge around that, but some organisations just coming out with, they're making it about women's health and the benefits that they offer, meaning that you can do things like the organisation will reimburse you to travel out of state if you need to, and sort of cover those abortion costs. So and there's a lot. The list has grown, right, of organisations that are doing that. So I think that's one real tangible way that organisations can support women in the light of that recent news. I think similarly how we've talked about in the past, but is how you think about your employee support groups, kind of your employee assistance programs. I think they're all other ways that you could think about offering support. Because some of it, I think, because it is so emotional, and we've talked about our own experiences, incredibly anxiety inducing. I think also thinking about the mental health impacts for colleagues is going to be incredibly important, as well as actually, how do you support, from a broader benefits perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that kind of leads us on to our next topic, which is, what can organizations do? So as you say, companies like, I think Dick's Sporting Goods in the US was one of the first to come out. I saw this video on LinkedIn. But since then, Google, SAP, Meta, Netflix, like a few others, actually a lot more now, obviously having Monday, Tuesday to catch up, are coming out to say, and what I'm generally seeing is, we will pay for your travel, and you and a partner in some cases to travel to a state where you need to get the health care that you need. So with that said, beyond that, what can organizations do in light of this recent news? So you mentioned having those support groups, right?
Yeah. I also think with my EX hat on, and I think it's sort of possibly being a bit brave in this space, but I think it's getting that employee voice. So with my EX hat on, that is talking to colleagues, and it isn't just women. Like, women are obviously the most impacted, but it is going to be the partners and our sort of male allies as well. So I think it's talking to colleagues, sort of getting that understanding, engaging with your diversity, equity, and inclusion teams are all really positive steps. But I think the key thing, like you've said, is it feels like this is something that we have to respond quite quickly on, and I think some of the quickest things, like we've said, are around the benefit side of things. But maybe then thinking, as this plays out, because there's obviously various states with their trigger laws, and I've seen quite a few maps over the last few days of which states are going to be doing certain things. But as it kind of plays out, so starting to develop a longer term strategy. And I think if you do or haven't thought previously about women's health as a broader topic, because I think the kind of reproductive health of pregnancy is one side of it, but there's also menopause, menstruation leave, lots of different, it's a sort of very broad topic, right, that I think you can then be thinking about more broadly, and thinking through that sort of human-centered design process is sort of speaking to colleagues, understanding their viewpoint, and starting to craft longer term your kind of policies and kind of processes around what is it that colleagues need.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And with that comes, as you say, it's kind of brave, because it will be confronting, because you don't just want to listen to employees who are necessarily pro, abortion reimbursement policies. In order for this to be an effective EX listening engagement, you have to go out and get the broadest voice. And I think that's an important part of the change process. And I think I'd mentioned this on a podcast before, and in a webinar with Panelit recently. we can't expect, even for what appears to be fairly liberal organisations, for everyone to have the same viewpoint. You know, you're
No.
going to have the polarisation of views here in organisations, and you also have to be careful about how you navigate that from an EX perspective and from a comms perspective. Yeah, regardless of whether or not you're taking a hard stance on it or not. And I think those EX focus groups, as you say, they'll come in maybe the second iteration of response here. Those will be really important.
And I also think this is when, again, EX hat, the sort of thinking about different personas and the needs of those personas is going to be really important. So, for example, how do you equip people leaders to be able to engage in conversations with their team? How do they support if they do have, a female employee in their team that is going through that experience? We need to be thinking about the different groups that would need support, I think, in order to manage some of this. So again, thinking through who are those different personas is going to be really, really crucial. And then thinking about what do they need in order to have this kind of conversation, because it is incredibly, as we said, incredibly emotive. It's going to make people feel super uncomfortable because you've got the kind of socio-political angle, but you've also just got, it's a topic about reproductive health, which I think just would make some people feel uncomfortable anyway. So there's a lot that you have to unpack, and I think organizations need to be thinking through how best to do that. And some of that sort of persona view and that kind of journey mapping for me would be another one, in terms of how you could do some of this stuff. That gives it the structure. Like, I almost think your plan needs to be, what do we come out with in the short term, but the longer term piece is talk to colleagues, go through that sort of iteration of what you're designing, and make sure it then works for your organization. Because like you say, you can't assume that everybody's going to have the same viewpoint, because they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I guess kind of building on it a little bit as well, it's also looking at existing processes. So, for example, if you have a pregnancy loss program at work and a pregnancy loss resources, maybe now is a really good time to go back to those and say, how would someone who's going through an elective abortion look at this? Or do we have support for someone who's going through an elective abortion? Because I know a lot of the resources that we have available at the moment talk very much about, pregnancy loss as a wanted pregnancy, which in most times is when people would take time off, but that's not always the case. And so I think this is also kind of a good opportunity to look at, how do we talk about pregnancy loss in general, and how do we not, marginalize people who are going through a pregnancy loss, because an abortion is a pregnancy loss, and ensure that we're supporting them as well. And I think, kind of building on the other point you made, is offering support to employees who right now as well may have, similar to us, been kind of shocked or upset by this going on, and kind of refreshing people's memories that they have support programs in place. If your company offers subscriptions like BetterHelp, for example, or if you have pregnancy loss counselling as a benefit, this kind of stuff resurfaces a lot of trauma for people. So I also think it's in the immediate response, kind of saying, here's what we're doing in terms of reimbursement. And also, if you're finding this really hard to cope with, which is definitely the kind of what I've seen on social media and on LinkedIn, is saying, this has really shocked me. We definitely want to be doing that as well. I think the other thing that we need to be considering, and this will come after the immediate response, is how do we protect employees claiming reimbursement benefits here? And so I mentioned this earlier in the episode, but this to me, and this is my initial reflection, is this falls under a reproductive health reimbursement policy. And so in the same way that you would offer potentially reimbursement for fertility treatment, you don't ask what the reimbursement is for necessarily, if you can. And I say this from a privacy and protection perspective, because what you don't want is for an employee to come forward with all the trust in the world that they will get the support they need, the financial reimbursement to travel out of state to go and get an abortion, and then they face discrimination in the workplace further down the line for having submitted that request, right? And so
Yeah.
that calls into question of how do we safeguard this in kind of a
Mm.
similar way to whistleblowing? How do we ensure people coming
Yeah.
forward to make these claims are supported? And also, how do we support maybe secondary caregivers or partners of people who require an abortion if their employers aren't supporting them? So do we extend this benefit to everybody, regardless of whether or not they're the one facing the abortion or not? So those are just a few things that I think need to be ironed out, absolutely. And I think there will be not a cooling off period, but like a bit of time between
Yeah.
announcing that this is what we're doing and implementation to think through those things. But we really have to think about how do we ensure people are protected and they're safe and they're not going to be discriminated against in future because of this.
Yeah, agree. I think that's a really good point about the discrimination side of things. And yeah, I think our advice to organisations would be the short-term view, but then also, some of those longer-term challenges. And I think that they'll take a bit of time to play out for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So, topic 3, this is going to be a long episode, and rightly so. This is an incredibly important topic. From an EX design perspective, I know we've spoken a little bit about this. What are some of the things that organizations can consider as they start to develop policies around this? And so I know we've spoken about protecting employees' privacy and going out and talking to employees and a diverse range of employees. But is there anything else we think from an EX human centered design perspective we'd throw in here?
So I was sort of thinking, and this to me is probably, again, a bit of a longer term view, but it's thinking through as people start to go through that experience. So there's almost the laws get passed, there's the benefits that are offered, and then people actually start to go through some of that experience. I think there's then the piece which we would do with some of our other experiences at work, but just kind of working through understanding from those that have been through that experience what's working, what's not working, and thinking about how do you hear from those voices. I think so. We've talked about the sort of human centered design, going out, whether that's interviewing, whether you're, I'm not sure, surveying, pulse surveying in this sort of scenario would probably cut it. So I wouldn't recommend that necessarily as a way to go for this kind of topic initially. But sort of that voice piece, I think, is going to be incredibly important. And when people go through that experience, because I almost think we could, a bit like when you return to work after mat leave, right? Like it's almost like we focus so much on the leading up to, and we've talked before about how the return gets neglected. And I think that needs to be something that organizations consider is the sort of return to work after you've gone through that experience.
Yeah.
And how do you hear the employee voice, whether that's the partner of somebody that's gone through that, or the person themselves. I think that would be a really key one. But in some ways, I'd almost say with an EX lens to not sort of look at it differently to some of the other experiences that we would think about, because actually it needs that. I think the only thing it needs more is that sort of level of care and attention, because it is such an emotive topic. And the point you raised about privacy, I think, is super important too. But almost like the skills and the kind of EX methodology, if you like, I just think they're incredibly important in this sort of experience, right?
Absolutely agreed. And as much as like we want the immediate response to be as immediate as possible, as you say, you can't look over the importance of a thorough EX design process. And so, checking your own bias as a team. Do we have the right people in the room to be making decisions about this? Do we have the right representation here? Are we talking about, if we talk about, as we have done, marginalized groups, do we have those marginalized groups in the room? And if we don't, do we have someone that can voice an opinion from those groups?
Exactly.
And so I think, yeah, it's kind of like get something out there, have a voice, have an opinion, not necessarily overcommitting to the detail and then going through this process. And I think also part of that as an organization, my advice would be honest about that. And when you're saying we are offering reimbursement support, follow that up with a comms that says, in addition to this, we are going to be formulating a proper program of support, a proper, way of doing this, governance, etc. Please bear with us because we want to do it properly. Here's the rough timeline, but we are here for you in the immediate term. And I think being honest about that as well is healthy, and it kind of, I guess it covers a bit as well if you're taking your time to come up with something that is proper. Yeah. So I would say that's important.
Agreed.
Too.
And I think what it does, which ultimately is what I think you'd be looking for in your organization, that builds a culture of trust, that you're being transparent about where you might have some of the answers for now, but actually where you're going to work through and how you're going to involve employees in that sort of process. So I think that is super important.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Fabulous. Okay, we're at 45 minutes already.
This has been one of our longest ones, the two of us together. But it feels like a heavy topic, but I think hopefully, well, it is really topical and relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously a lot of personal updates in there for us as well. So
exactly.
As always, here if anyone wants to talk. And, I'm an independent consultant, so I will say this on record. If you're an organization looking to do something around this and you need help, you need a different perspective, an EX design lens, please reach out to me. I will willingly give you my time for free to help you get this over the line. It is an incredibly important topic for both of us. So, absolutely the offer is there. And as always, please reach out to us and hopefully we haven't been too political. I don't think we have. I think we've been.
I don't think so. I hope. I feel like even how I feel talking through, I feel like we've been very, very sort of personal about our own experience, but hopefully not too political. Like we've talked more about, practically how can organisations respond and things that organisations need to think about. You let us know.
I'm sure people will.
Some people sliding into our DMs. I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone so much for joining us. We are back next week with a very exciting guest joining us from Qualtrics. So super exciting to have them on the podcast. And as we said, we will be resuming normal podcasting right up until I am probably likely to pop this baby out. So more to come from us. And as always, like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, send us any suggestions if there's something else you want us to cover. And we will see you next week for episode 31. Bye.
Bye everyone. Thank you.